What comes to mind when you hear the name Catherine Howard? For most, it's likely the scandalous reputation or her tragic end on the executioner's block. But Catherine Howard was much more than a victim of her own mistakes. She was a young woman, thrust into the treacherous world of the Tudor court, a world of power, politics, and perilous ambition. In this video, we'll uncover the real story behind Catherine Howard, her rise, her fall, and her lasting impact on the infamous reign of Henry VIII. Catherine Howard's early life and family background. Catherine Howard was born around 1521 to an aristocratic but relatively impoverished family. She was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful men in England. Despite her noble lineage, Catherine's family had fallen on hard times, and her early years were far from the privileged upbringing you might expect for someone who would one day become queen. Her mother, Joyce Culpeper, died when Catherine was young, and as a result, she was sent to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Duchess's household was a bustling place, filled with young aristocratic women under the care of their formidable matron. But while the outward appearance of the household was respectable, the reality was much more lax. The young women, including Catherine, were left unsupervised for long periods, allowing for a somewhat informal and even reckless environment. It was here that Catherine's first brushes with scandal began. By the time she was a teenager, Catherine had entered into a flirtatious relationship with her music teacher, Henry Manox. Though their affair was not deeply serious, it would later be used against her in a web of accusations that would culminate in her tragic fate. As Catherine matured, she caught the attention of another man, Francis Derham, a secretary in the Duchess's household. Unlike her earlier flirtations, this relationship was more intense. Some historians suggest that the pair even referred to each other as husband and wife. But in Tudor England, such terms had weight. Their relationship and the possibility of a pre-contract and informal engagement would become a critical element in the charges that eventually led to her downfall. The political environment of Henry VIII's court. To understand Catherine Howard's rise to the position of queen, we must first take a closer look at the political environment in which she lived. The Tudor court was a place of intense ambition, where noble families jostled for power and influence over the king. By the 1530s, Henry VIII had already been married 4 times, and his court was a web of competing factions. Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been his queen for nearly 24 years, but their marriage ended in a bitter divorce that split England from the Catholic Church. His second wife, the infamous Anne Boleyn, had met a gruesome end, executed for treason and adultery. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had died shortly after giving birth to his only male heir, Edward. And his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, had been discarded after a brief and unhappy marriage. By the time Catherine Howard entered Henry's life, the king was aging, plagued by ill health, and desperate for the passion and vitality that had long since faded from his life. Catherine's rise to prominence was closely tied to the political ambitions of her family. Her uncle Thomas Howard, the powerful Duke of Norfolk, was eager to restore his family's influence at court after the fall of his niece, Anne Boleyn. For the Howards, Catherine represented an opportunity, a chance to place another Howard queen beside Henry VIII, and thus secure their hold over the kingdom's most powerful man. This is your invitation to a front row seat on our channel. Subscribe today, like, share, and comment on this video, and become a part of our community. The rise of Catherine Howard at court. Catherine Howard entered court life as a maid of honour to Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Although she was still very young, perhaps no more than 18 at the time, Catherine quickly caught the attention of the ageing king. Where Anne of Cleves had failed to inspire any affection or desire in Henry, Catherine's youth, beauty, and flirtatious nature enraptured him. Within months, Henry was lavishing her with gifts and affection, and it became clear to those at court that Catherine was poised to replace Anne of Cleves as queen. In July 1540, just days after his marriage to Anne was annulled, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace. Catherine's marriage to Henry marked a high point in her short life. She was now the Queen of England, and for a brief period she basked in the attention and privileges that came with her new status. Henry, who was nearing 50 and suffering from leg ulcers and obesity, saw Catherine as a source of rejuvenation. In her, he found the youth and beauty he so desperately sought to recapture in his own declining years. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect match, dark clouds were gathering. Catherine Howard's role in Henry VIII's court. Once Catherine Howard became queen, her role at court was both ceremonial and influential. As the wife of Henry VIII, she was expected to play a key part in the royal household's daily life, and her conduct was scrutinized closely by courtiers and foreign ambassadors alike. However, Catherine's limited political knowledge and young age meant that she did not engage directly in the kingdom's governance, unlike her predecessors, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, who had both played more active roles in political matters. Nonetheless, Catherine's marriage to Henry VIII carried significant political weight. The Howard family, with their strong ties to the English nobility and their ambitions, saw her as a tool to increase their influence. For Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's marriage to the king was a triumph, a way to redeem the family after the fall of Anne Boleyn, his niece, who had been executed just a few years earlier. Catherine's uncle encouraged her to cultivate Henry's affections and, in doing so, hoped to steer the king away from the reformist tendencies he had begun to exhibit. As a Catholic, Norfolk wanted to halt the spread of Protestantism in England and saw the marriage of Catherine, a loyal member of the Howard family, as an opportunity to shift the king's religious policy. However, Catherine's inability to navigate the dangerous political waters of Henry's court left her largely a figurehead, manipulated by her more experienced family members. While Henry VIII adored Catherine during the early months of their marriage, her failure to produce an heir became a growing concern. Henry had long sought a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, and the death of his third wife, Jane Seymour, after giving birth to Edward, had left the king longing for more children. As time passed without any sign of pregnancy from Catherine, Henry's initial passion for her began to cool. This, combined with her flirtations and past indiscretions, set the stage for her downfall, the role of religion and Catherine's influence on Henry's religious policies. One of the most significant aspects of Henry VIII's reign was the religious turmoil that defined the period. His break with the Catholic Church, over his divorce from Catherine of Aragon in the 1530s, led to the establishment of the Church of England, with Henry himself as its supreme head. However, England remained deeply divided between Catholics and Reformers, and Henry's own religious views were often contradictory. Catherine Howard, as a member of the conservative Howard family, was a devout Catholic. Though she lacked the political savvy to actively engage in religious reforms, her presence at court represented a victory for the Catholic faction, which hoped to use her influence over Henry to shift the country back towards traditional Catholic practices. Her marriage was seen as a potential way to reverse some of the changes that had been implemented under Anne Boleyn and the Protestant reformers. However, Catherine's religious influence was minimal. Her brief reign as queen did not bring about any significant changes in Henry's religious policies, largely because she lacked the political acumen and experience to challenge Henry's advisors or shape policy in any meaningful way. Unlike her cousin Anne Boleyn, whose marriage to Henry had been a catalyst for the English Reformation, Catherine was more of a passive participant in the religious struggles of the time. In this way, she remained largely a pawn in the hands of those who sought to use her position for their own ends. Life as Queen of England. At first, Catherine Howard's life as Queen seemed charmed. She enjoyed the wealth, luxury, and influence that came with being Henry VIII's wife. As queen, she had her own household, filled with ladies in waiting, and she was the centre of attention at court. But her time in the spotlight was short-lived. Catherine's immaturity, inexperience, and the loose moral education she had received in her grandmother's household would soon prove her undoing. She was playful, flirtatious, and perhaps even naive in her understanding of the gravity of her position. Despite being married to the king, she continued to entertain the affections of other men at court, most notably Thomas Culpeper, a handsome young courtier who had once been a favourite of the king himself. Their relationship began innocently enough. Culpeper had served as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and his duties brought him into frequent contact with the Queen. But soon, their relationship grew more intimate. Secret meetings were arranged, facilitated by Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, who had also played a role in the downfall of Anne Boleyn. For Catherine, these clandestine encounters may have felt like a continuation of the carefree life she had led before becoming queen. But for the Tudor court, where treachery and betrayal lurked around every corner, they were a dangerous gamble. Catherine's relationships with her ladies-in-waiting. Catherine Howard's relationships with her ladies-in-waiting were both crucial to her daily life and central to the unfolding of her tragic story. As queen, she was surrounded by a circle of women who attended to her needs, accompanied her at court, and, in many cases, shared her secrets. Among these women was Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn and sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn. Lady Rochford had already been involved in the downfall of Anne Boleyn, having given testimony that helped convict both Anne and her husband, George, of treason. Despite her tarnished reputation, she remained at court and became a close confidant of Catherine Howard. It was Lady Rochford who would later facilitate the secret meetings between Catherine and Thomas Culpeper, meetings that would ultimately lead to the Queen's execution. In addition to Lady Rochford, Catherine's household included several other women who had known her since her time in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household. Many of these women were aware of Catherine's past relationships with Henry Manox and Francis Dereham, but they kept these secrets for fear of losing their positions in court. However, when the truth about Catherine's indiscretions began to emerge, it was her closest companions who were interrogated and forced to reveal what they knew about the Queen's behaviour. The complicity of her ladies-in-waiting in her downfall shows the delicate and often dangerous relationships that existed in the Tudor court. Trust was a rare commodity, and those closest to the Queen could just as easily betray her as protect her. In Catherine's case, her reliance on Lady Rochford and others to maintain her secret liaisons with Culpeper contributed directly to the scandal that would cost her life: the downfall of Catherine Howard. The downfall of Catherine Howard began with rumours. By late 1541, whispers of her past indiscretions with Henry Manox and Francis Dereham had reached the king's ear. At first, Henry refused to believe the accusations. He had fallen deeply in love with Catherine, and the idea that she might have been unfaithful even before their marriage was unbearable to him. But as more evidence came to light, Henry was forced to confront the truth. Catherine's previous relationship with Dereham was investigated, and it was discovered that Dereham had been appointed to a position in her household after she became queen. This decision, likely made out of a desire to keep her past hidden, only added fuel to the fire. It suggested that Catherine was trying to cover up her indiscretions, and worse, that she might still have feelings for Dereham. The situation grew even more perilous when Catherine's secret meetings with Thomas Culpeper were revealed. Love letters between the Queen and Culpeper were discovered, sealing her fate. To Henry, this was not just a case of youthful indiscretion. It was treason. The Queen had betrayed him, and in the eyes of the Tudor court, such betrayal could not go unpunished. The impact of Catherine's downfall on the Howard family. The downfall of Catherine Howard had far-reaching consequences, not just for the young Queen herself, but for her powerful family as well. The Howards, who had worked so diligently to place Catherine on the throne, saw their influence crumble in the wake of her arrest. For the Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's execution was a devastating blow to his political ambitions. Though he had worked tirelessly to maintain his family's position in court, his niece's disgrace threatened to undo all his efforts. Worse still, the accusations against Catherine reopened old wounds surrounding Anne Boleyn's execution. The Howard family was once again tainted by scandal, and their standing in court suffered accordingly. Despite this, Thomas Howard managed to retain some of his power and influence after Catherine's death, largely due to his careful navigation of the shifting political landscape. However, the Howard name would forever be associated with the two tragic queens, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, who had both fallen victim to Henry's wrath. For years to come, the Howard family would struggle to distance themselves from these painful associations. The arrest and trial. Catherine Howard was arrested in November 1541. She was confined to her apartments at Hampton Court Palace, where she would spend the next several months in a state of panic and despair. Though she pleaded with the king for mercy, her fate was already sealed. Henry was heartbroken, humiliated, and enraged. His love for Catherine had turned to bitterness, and his anger knew no bounds. In December, Catherine was stripped of her title as queen, and her former lovers, Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper, were put on trial for treason. Both men were found guilty, and their executions were brutal. Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered, while Culpeper, having been a close servant of the king, was granted the mercy of a beheading. Catherine herself was not put on trial, as her guilt was already considered proven. Instead, she was condemned by an Act of Attainder, a legal procedure that allowed Parliament to sentence her to death without the need for a formal trial. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was led to the scaffold at the Tower of London. The execution. On the day of her execution, Catherine Howard was barely 21 years old. According to contemporary accounts, she faced her death with remarkable composure, though the fear and terror she must have felt are unimaginable. She was led to the scaffold dressed in a simple gown, her head held high as she prepared to meet her fate. Before kneeling at the block, Catherine is said to have made a brief speech asking for God's forgiveness and praying for the well-being of the king. In her final moments, she showed a grace and dignity that many might not have expected from the young, flirtatious girl who had so captivated Henry VIII just a few short years earlier. With a single stroke of the executioner's axe, Catherine Howard's life was cut tragically short. She was buried alongside her cousin, Anne Boleyn, in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London, the psychological toll on Henry VIII. Catherine Howard's downfall also had a profound psychological impact on Henry VIII. By the time of her execution, Henry was no longer the handsome, charismatic king of his youth. He had become a paranoid, embittered man, haunted by the betrayals he had experienced in his marriages and plagued by physical ailments that only compounded his emotional turmoil. The revelation of Catherine's infidelity shook Henry to his core. He had truly loved her, or at least loved the idea of her, and her betrayal was a bitter reminder of the failures of his previous marriages. His anger and heartbreak were so intense that, according to some reports, he wept upon learning of her death. Yet his deep emotional wounds were masked by the severity with which he dealt with Catherine and those associated with her. Catherine's execution marked a turning point in Henry's life. In the years that followed, he became even more unpredictable and tyrannical. His sixth and final marriage to Catherine Parr would be a more sober and pragmatic union, one rooted in companionship rather than passion. By the time of his death in 1547, Henry had become a shadow of his former self, a king whose legacy would be forever marked by the destruction of his wives and the chaotic religious and political shifts that had defined his reign. Catherine Howard's legacy. Catherine Howard's life and death are often overshadowed by the more infamous stories of Henry VIII's other wives, particularly Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon. Yet her story is no less significant. Catherine's brief reign as queen is a testament to the dangers that accompanied life in the Tudor court, particularly for women. Her downfall was, in many ways, a product of the ruthless political machinations of the time. She was a pawn in the power struggles of her family and the ambitions of those around her. But she was also a young woman who made mistakes that cost her everything. In the centuries since her death, Catherine Howard has been both vilified and pitied. Some have portrayed her as a foolish girl who brought about her own destruction, while others see her as a tragic figure caught in a web of political intrigue that was far beyond her control. If this story left you wanting more, imagine what's waiting in the next video. Subscribe now, like, comment, share the video, and never miss another history's most dramatic moments. See you in the next video.